Hi there, listener, and welcome to episode 253 of the Ski Podcast. This episode is the latest in a series of podcasts I've been publishing focusing on women in the snow sports industry. Previous episodes have included BBC Ski Sunday presenter Chemmy Alcott, GB Snowsport CEO Vicky Gosling, and former-Erna Managing Director Joanna Yellowlees-Bound. Today, I speak with Fiona Easdale, Managing Director and co-founder of the Val d'Isère chalet specialist YSE Ski. Now, if you've listened to episode 251 about the rise and fall of Bladon Lines, you will already know the big part that Fiona plays in that story. I wasn't able to speak to her before that episode went out, so this interview fits in really well around that. And listener, if you haven't listened to episode 251 yet, my first question is why? Of all the 266 episodes of the Ski Podcast I've published, it's the one I'm most proud of. If you have listened, this interview will give you some more context to that story. But even if you haven't, Fiona's story is compelling. She was racing downhill in the Winter Olympics at just 16 years old, then worked in sports management with World Cup winning footballers before her return to the ski industry with Bladon Lines. There, she rose through the ranks to become managing director before going off on her own to set up YSE Ski with John Yates-Smith, a company that's now been in business for over 30 years. Now, before we start, I'd like to thank Innsbruck Ski Hire for sponsoring the show. If you are heading to the snow, listener, then don't forget you can save money when you book your ski hire at Innsbruck Rent and use the code SKIPODCAST. You'll get a guaranteed discount for ski hire in France, Austria and Switzerland. And to make it even simpler, you don't need to use the code. Just take the link in the show notes and your basket will automatically be reduced. Right, let's listen to my interview with YSE Ski co-founder Fiona Easdale. It's a real pleasure to welcome Fiona Easdale to the Ski Podcast today. Hi, Fiona. Can I just ask, whereabouts are you today?
I'm in Sherburn, Dorset.
Okay, what a beautiful place to be. Is it as hot as the rest of the country today?
It is stiflingly hot.
I mean, I was at an event with Les Trois Vallées last night, and they were telling me it's 30 degrees plus in the Alps as well. So, I mean, you're a Val d'Isère specialist. So the question I always like to ask my guests to start off with is, where and when did you ski or snowboard last? I'm guessing for you that was in Val d'Isère, was it?
Yes, I was the first week of April.
Cool. What were conditions like then?
It was getting a bit short of snow, and then they had that enormous dump about 10 days after we left. I was just amazed because I was wondering how they were going to survive till the end. It was very hot. We had a bit of trouble skiing back to Val d'Isère. We went down to Tignes-les-Brévières and literally was skiing on patches of snow. And then they had over a metre in Val d'Isère.
Yeah, I mean, that end of the season, it's interesting in recent years, April has continued to produce really good snow. Owning a ski company that is a specialist in one resort, do you end up going to other ski resorts as well, or do all of your trips end up being to Val d'Isère?
We've got friends who used to have a very posh chalet in Maribel, and we loved going there, but sadly they've sold it. We've also got friends who've got an apartment in Tignes, but that's still skiing Val d'Isère Tignes. So.
Excellent. So, you know, you're now at YSE and you're managing director there. I think listeners may well have listened to my interview with John Yates-Smith in episode 231. He was very complimentary about your organisational skills. They say behind every successful man, there's a woman, or as I recently read that Jim Carrey said, behind every great man, there's a woman rolling her eyes. He said he couldn't work without you at all. You know, he's the front of house, but you're the brains behind the operation. Is that how it kind of feels to you?
No, he is the ideas, and I am the one who tempers the ideas. I take out more outrageous comments, both on his today's photo and on the website. I'm trusted with things like booking conditions, prices, boring how to book text, and he does the more imaginative chalet descriptions, the where to ski in Val d'Isère, when to go, etc.
Well, you need to have both for sure. And can I ask you, ahead of the new season, how are early sales looking for winter 25-26?
They've been a bit sluggish, but we're ploughing on and it's good. And actually, early season, kind of December, is pretty good. So we're quite pleased.
Okay. Do you think that when you have really hot weather, as we have at the moment in the UK, that deters people from thinking about skiing holidays?
Well, we certainly don't regard July or August as big booking periods. We get a big rush in January, February, March, when those who want a definite chalet, definite date book. And then we also seem to get a bit more of a rush in September when schools go back. But there are more late bookings than there used to be.
That's interesting. I was actually reading some research by the Mountain Trade Network yesterday, which was suggesting, I think, that maybe across the whole market, only 10% of bookings are made in the final month. Do you think that aligns with what you're looking at?
No, I think I mean probably more than a month, 6 weeks. So people that might have, a lot of people get their fingers burnt because then the chalet they want isn't available. And, they kind of say, when did that book? And we say, oh, back in March. And following year, they're there in February.
Well, we'll come back to the nature of the chalet market as it stands now, but and also the founding of the company, some of the challenges that you faced in those many years in business. I wondered if I could take you back now. I'm going to specifically pick Innsbruck in February 1976, because at Innsbruck it was the Winter Olympic Games and you were representing Great Britain at the time. And I tried to do a bit of research on this, but it seemed to me that you were only 16 years old at the time, competing in the downhill GS and slalom. Is that right?
Yeah, it was about 2 weeks before my 17th birthday. But I don't think I was quite the youngest. We had a pretty young girls' team, well, ladies' team, or whatever you like to call it. I don't think we were really women by then, so girls' team. Valentina Eilif was only 21 or something, so and she was very old to us. And the rest of us were about 16, 17, 18.
Right. Okay. I did actually look up to try and find out if you were the youngest competitor at the time. What I did discover is, these days, I think anyone who follows the Winter Olympics with freestyle events will see that teenagers taking part in big air and slopestyle, etc., is pretty common. Much rarer that it would happen in the Alpine ski events. I did find a skier called Seba Johnson who competed at 14 for the Virgin Islands. But apparently there were a few teenagers in the British team then. Therefore, I guess my next question is, some people don't even start skiing at that age. So how and where did you learn to ski?
I first started when I was 4 in Lech. My parents were very democratic, and my elder sister had gone at 4 because some friends of theirs were taking their 4-year-old to a Rosa. And we went to Lech, and I went at 4, and my brother went at 4. And that was that, really.
Great. And so you started then. What about the racing side of things? How did you segue into that? There's a big difference from, being a learner in an Austrian ski school and moving on to racing.
Well, after 3 years in Lech, we went to Saas-Fee, and my sister was in the top children's class and didn't like it because all the other children spoke German and she didn't. And a ski instructor advised us to go to Wengen, where there was the downhill-only ski club. Little did we know that the following year we would go. My sister joined DHO, my brother and I joined Coggins, and we would end up going there for about the next 10 years. So it was quite a momentous suggestion by that teacher.
Right. And so you were doing race training as part of the downhill only club over in Wengen?
Yes.
Were you racing in the UK at all? Were there,
No.
dry slopes to practice on?
No. I have done a bit, but I have not done any racing.
Well, I was more thinking about the build-up and the opportunity to practice, because obviously at that age you were in education most of the time as well. Were you competing on the World Cup circuit or the Europa Cup circuit?
No, we were taken down the DHO to various events, British Junior Ski Championships and some FIS races. And I did my O-levels. We did them earlier in those days. I did them when I was 15 and a half, and I was asked to join the British ski team. And I had this terrible kind of half term of the summer term where my father was going away, and he'd written the note to my school saying I was going to leave after my O-levels. And I had to walk half a mile to the post office and post box and post it if I wanted to leave. They wanted it to be my decision, not theirs. And I finally took the walk and dropped it in the post box and thought, what have I done? And I left school at 15 and a half. And the condition was that I took A-levels. So I did one by correspondence course and one at a tutor's in London.
Okay, so that was a big decision at the age of 15. You said you were, under 17, only 16 years old when you were at the Winter Olympics in 1976. So how and when did you find out that you'd been selected, that you'd made the right decision there?
I think probably at the beginning of that 75-76 season. I mean, it was quite difficult because there were some people who weren't selected and some who were. It was a difficult time because we were all great friends and we all trained together, but I was one of the lucky ones.
I think in every team, when people are training and competing against each other, there's always this balance between the support for your teammates and the fact that maybe it might be you who's missed out. And it sounds like a slightly different situation because I think these days there are a lot of thresholds in terms of FIS points and things like that need to be achieved to be selected. But, you were selected and you did go to the games. And, I looked up your results. You competed in downhill, GS and slalom. I think at the time, all the three events that were available, you got a top 10 in the combined. That's a pretty good result, I would say.
Well, the slalom and the combined were okay. I think the downhill and the giant slalom, I was just glad to have competed them. But of course, the events in those days were very different to now. We didn't have Super G. We only had one run in the giant slalom. And our combined wasn't a separate event. That was a combined of the three events we did. So if you were a downhill specialist, you didn't compete in the combined. It's quite different now.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be completely dismissive about it. It still sounds like a top 10 at the Winter Olympics to me. And while, the downhillers might not compete in slalom, the ability to compete in the different disciplines is a skill in itself. And, downhill ski racing at the age of 16, I think most people would think that, you hit your peak for downhill racing in your mid-30s, possibly. You're going very fast, let's say.
I did go to a talk at the Ski Club of Great Britain between Chemmy Alcott and Helen Tompkinson, who competed back in the 40s, I think, maybe 50s. And I got more and more depressed. This was probably 15 years ago, because more of what Helen said reflected on my racing days than what Chemmy did. I mean, I remembered lace-up ski boots. I remembered cable bindings. I remember having yellow slalom poles. And of course, those don't even exist today. And I came away feeling really quite old. And actually, at the time, I wasn't.
Well, for sure. But I mean, I am old enough to remember the lace-up boots and those bindings as well. But I wasn't skiing downhill in the Olympics, and actually saw a great quote from you. I can't remember where I found this. At the time, you said, "Nobody gives us a chance. Why should they against the Alpine countries? But we're having a go." And, that sounds like exactly the attitude that you have to take into those sort of events.
In those days, every nation got 2 entries into World Cup. And I think we got, I don't know whether it was 3 or just the 2 in the Olympics. So as you said, there weren't any of the thresholds. But it did mean that possibly some of us were elevated to skiing in events that we possibly shouldn't have been skiing in, if you see what I mean. I mean, we took advantage of those places because they came with free accommodation and we didn't have much money. And I think really we'd have been better if a lot of us had just been skiing Europa Cup or even FIS races. And whilst it was great and I was very lucky to be able to do that, I think possibly I was promoted above where I actually should have been, possibly might have been happier skiing. I mean, downhill terrified me.
As I'm sure it would terrify everyone.
Well, it terrified all of that kind of band of us who were that age at the time. Putting your skis sideways was sometimes the only way to get round a corner. And now I look back and I see them pushing like mad out the start, and I'm going, ah.
For sure, though. But I mean, you are saying you already referred to the equipment that you had. I mean, it's a very, very different setup now for racers from the type of equipment you were racing on then. You wouldn't have the same kind of support. But can I ask you about some of the other Team GB members? You mentioned I can't remember who it was, but one of
Valentine
you,
Ryan.
right, who was 21, who seemed very old to you. I looked up the rest of the team, and it seemed like Konrad Bartelski was part of that team as well, who was only 21 himself, perhaps.
Yes, I know. We didn't have a huge amount to do with the boys' team. We did because we saw them at races, but we trained separately. We had a fairly, well, when I first started, fierce manager called Maria Goldberger. I won't say she disapproved, but she certainly thought she should keep her girls separate. No, we did see Konrad, and there was Peter Fuchs and Alan Stewart and Stuart Fitzsimmons. There were a lot of them, but and then another manager came in, Ginna and Ollie Hart, and we were much more inclusive when they came in.
Okay, and what about Britain's a gold medalist from the games, John Curry, the ice skater? Did you come across him at all while you were there?
I didn't come across him, but I was there. We sat in the aisle and no one seemed to care. And when he won his gold medal, the only flowers we could find were those in little boxes going down the aisle. So we were pulling up these flowers to chuck them in. It was amazing. I mean, to see him get that gold. But he was very much wrapped in cotton wool in the Olympic Village. He didn't really mix very much.
I'm sure he was. I mean, maybe that's a commitment that you need to have to become a gold medalist. Another gold medalist from those games, perhaps one of the breakout stars, was Franz Klammer. Did you get a ringside seat to his race at all?
I watched that on television, but we did know some of the Austrians because we all trained in Solden. We all trained in various places and we'd all be in the same hotel. Biggest shock of my life was going to a sauna. And of course, we all went in our swimsuits and there were half of the Austrian team naked. And we were young, kind of 16-year-olds. And I remember we all just left and they were all saying, come back. And so I've seen quite a lot of the Austrian team of that age, probably more than I expected to.
That is the very much the Teutonic way of doing saunas. I've been to St Anton, to the wellness centre there before, and there are big signs on the way in for the saunas saying, no clothes allowed, and they have a warden guy who goes around to check that no one's wearing clothes in there. That's very entertaining. So can I ask you then, after the Olympics, I read, I can't remember where I found this, that you won the Ingham's Trophy for the most improved female skier of the year and a training grant. And you mentioned that you did A-levels. That was part of the deal that you made with your parents. Did you keep racing or did you go back to education after that?
Sadly, in the training run in Flaine for a Europa Cup, where I was in the correct category, they had a lot of snow and the side of the run, there was quite a lot of snow. No criticism of the course at all, but I came out at a gate and I felt my knee go, and I got up and put my skis on and realised they wouldn't go one way. And I got to a lift, which was one of those telebends. And I remember trying to indicate to the lift attendant that I could not jump onto the lift. And I got back to the hotel. And in fact, I'd done my medial ligaments. And I then spent months at a rehabilitation centre getting it strong. Then they decided I'd also damaged my lateral ligaments. So I had to have an operation on that. And about a year and 3 months later, I went out to Verbier to train. But really, I think partly the will wasn't there and partly my knee wasn't strong enough. So sadly, December 77 was the end of my ski racing.
We're aware that it can take quite a toll on the body, and evidently injuries like that, perhaps treatment might not be as good as it is available now. So did you go back into education? I mean, you're only about 18 or so at that stage.
Well, by that stage, I had my French A-level from Queensgate Place tutors, which I went to when I could. And then someone told me about Wolsey Hall. And so I did economics and trundled up to London to an exam centre where I sat amongst loads of people I didn't know and did my economics A-level. And that was it. I was 19 by then. I wasn't going to do any more, but I didn't go to university, no.
Again, as part of my research, did you work for IMG? Was that your kind of
Yes.
first kind of work? And, listeners, if they don't know them, my understanding is IMG is like a sports management agency. So that sounds like a great job to segue into for someone who's been an Olympic skier.
Well, I was so lucky. I literally met someone at dinner who said IMG looking for somebody. It was a secretarial role, and I just finished a secretarial course. And I went to work at IMG, and I worked in tennis. And I always wanted to work in skiing, but Iain Todd, who was also an Olympic skier, was the boss of IMG, and there was a guy who was going to work in skiing, so I never got that chance. But I then went to Italy to look after a footballer called Paolo Rossi, who scored lots of goals.
Well, I think he was a golden boot in the 82 World Cup, possibly.
He was. So I spent a year in Italy, and then I came back, and when they put me in charge of the Blue Cross tent for horses at the one-day Gatcombe Park one-day event, I decided that was the time to leave. I know nothing about horses and even less about Blue Cross tents. And I just happened to go to Henley, and I did know Mark Lines because I had a couple of friends who were friends of his, but I met Mark Lines and he said, we're looking for a contracts manager.
So that actually perfectly segues into our next section, our conversation about Bladon Lines. I think regular listeners will have heard my special episode about the rise and fall of Bladon Lines now. I'll put a link to the show notes if you haven't. I think it's such a tremendous story. I worked for Bladon Lines a few seasons, so I have that attachment to it. But when I recorded that episode, you were mentioned by almost everyone I interviewed, which is one of the reasons we're here today. So you started in 1983 and you met Mark Lines. The company is named after Simon Bladon and Mark Lines. So your first job there was working in contracting for them. And you said you had a French A-level, but I'm guessing your Italian was probably pretty good by then as well.
Well, my German was pretty good from ski racing because we had Austrian trainers, but I had a great job. I went abroad. We had a little Subaru Justice sitting at Geneva. I toddled up to ski resorts. I made all my appointments for the evenings. I skied most of the day, and it was a great job.
It sounds fantastic. Again, you probably need to listen to the Bladon Lines episode, but the rise of Bladon Lines, I'm saying you probably joined in about their 5th year or so, something like that, thinking back. And you were with them for, 7 years through the 80s, let's say. But you ultimately ended up becoming managing director. So how did that progress work from being a contracts manager who's brought in to becoming managing director?
I think I just got more and more bossy and more involved. And I think when Mark Lines left, there was no one else who could do it, really. I by then had met my husband. I didn't want to travel so much. But I do remember going to various resorts, including one in the Pyrenees, where I went with a girl called Emma Forrester, who now works for YSE. And we said to the guy, you don't have any black runs. And he simply took a black marker pen. We will make this one black and we will make that one black. And so he said, great, have you got any chalets? And it was just amazing, the expansion. Suddenly had chalets in Barège, we had them in Aransol, we had them in a place called Risoul, anywhere that had a ski resort and chalets. But it meant recruiting staff to work in those chalets was just so difficult.
I can fully understand that. And I sort of covered the staff side of things to a certain degree in the podcast. Having been someone who's been through that recruitment process myself, my first season with Bladon Lines was in 88, 89. There was a certain type of employee that you would generally take on board.
Yes. Mainly public school, but it got to the stage because most of the people we employed had to cook. And the saying went, the nearer the season, even a boiled egg was good enough. We were sending people out to work in ski resorts that really should not have been there. Now Bladon Lines is long gone, so no one's going to be able to complain about their holiday now. But you know, it was mainly girls, but these girls and guys did their best. But we had something like 300 staff. I mean, it was just madness, really.
Madness, but coordinating them all, having all the chalets on board, and we touched on this here in the other episode, but chalets are extremely different from what they're like today. I mean, these days it'd be highly unusual to go to a chalet and not to have ensuite facilities, whereas back then that was almost the norm, wasn't it?
Well, if I tell you, we had one chalet in Verbier for 6 that had one plug socket, and that was in the kitchen. I mean, it just beggars belief. We have, USB sockets next to the bed. Looking back at some of those chalets is just horrific, really.
Well, as he said, it was, I think a lot of them, Iain said to me when I interviewed him, Moman from Momentum Travel, who you mentioned earlier, that they were just, people's houses, people's homes that suddenly were, occupying, had like 10 people staying there and people sharing bathrooms, and the electricity wasn't up to it. There would be problems there. The plumbing wasn't up to it. And as you kind of referred to, sometimes maybe the staff weren't up to it either.
I mean, also, it was Bladon Lines made it more professional. But what happened with the ski pass money was very dangerous. I mean, we had a really, really lovely girl who was the rep, but they'd take the ski pass money on a Saturday, go to bed, and then take it down to the lift pass office the next day. And this girl got into bed and she heard a noise and she looked under the bed, and there was a very frightened guy who said, "Oh, I was told to lie in wait for you to take your money, but actually I can't. And this girl had, understandably, an absolute fit. And Iain was working, I can't even remember where he was working, but he was called upon the next day to go to Courmayeur and sort things out, which he did. He was amazing. He kind of went and calmed the girl down and sorted out and everything. But the fact that we were putting staff at that kind of risk. I mean, we had some guys in Verbier who took the money on a Saturday, it went into a bank account, but wasn't transferred to Televerbier till the Thursday. And between Saturday and Thursday, they were playing the New York Stock Exchange with it.
Yeah, I mean, having been through that situation as a rep, we're talking about, in most cases, pre-credit cards. So people were paying in cash. You'd have huge amounts of cash that you'd gather. If you're in one of the larger resorts where you had hundreds of guests, you're selling on the coach. Your lift tickets, your ski school, your ski hire, maybe some après ski on the bus as well. You'd gather all of this cash, and then you have to keep hold of it, in my case, and normally until the Monday morning when the bank opens. So you've got it Saturday night, all of Sunday, until Monday, 9 a.m. You'd be down at the bank straight away because you just wanted to be rid of it, for sure, because such a big responsibility.
Well, these guys were rid of it onto the New York Stock Exchange. And then one day it didn't go quite the way they wanted. And they had to come clean to Bladon Lines what they were doing.
Yeah, in some respects, having everyone paying with credit cards, etc., made it a lot easier. Although when I was doing those transfers, you had those massive machines where you'd have to kind of swipe the credit card back on a bit of paper. So your time at Bladon Lines ended in 1990, I think, and listeners will have heard, John Yates-Smith version of the story as to why. I wondered if I could ask you about, what happened there. You were managing director of the company at the time.
Mark Lines had just died, sadly, in a car accident. Christopher Needler, who owned Bladon Lines, had brought in members of the family to run a very upmarket side of it, and they were spending a fortune on that. And meanwhile, I was telling staff at Bladon Lines to, mend a chair leg. No, we're not buying you a new one, kind of thing. And I think in the end, blood was thicker than water. I was called in, not even by Christopher Needler, by an outplacement agency Then they paid an outplacement agency to come and do it. And they said, you're being made redundant. And they told me the terms, which at the time seemed a fortune, but now looking back, it wasn't. They then left, and a very nice girl at Bladon Lines said to them, I will see her out of the property. And she sat me down and she said, calm down. What are you going to do? So I said, well, 2 years ago, John suggested setting up a company. And I'd just got married and I thought this was madness. And I actually told Mark Lines, and he went out to Val d'Isère and gave John a talking to, and that was that. So I did know that John wanted to set up a company. So I rang him from Bladon Lines that day, and he said, come out to Corsica. And I did. And the rest is history.
Well, he did say that you rang him when he was in Corsica at the time, and they've got a separate interview with John Yates-Smith where you can find out what life was like in Corsica. You're talking about people hiding under the bed in Courmayeur. The Corsicans have their own ways of extracting money or putting pressure on people. But evidently, he was keen on that idea. You thought about it straight away. It didn't take you long then to decide that you wanted to set up your own company, which is a company you run now, YSE, standing for Yates-Smith Easdale.
I knew that Bladon Lines made over 60% of its profit in Val d'Isère. So it was a no-brainer.
Right. I mean, that is interesting because I did read that. I couldn't remember where I'd read it, but I read that of the 30 resorts that Bladon Lines were offering, 60% of the profits were made in Val d'Isère. So therefore, you clearly had strong motivation. And I believe, and I did ask John about this as well, but it was kind of made slightly easier by the fact that in terms of contracting, a number of the properties were actually contracted in his name rather than in Bladon Lines' name. Is that correct?
When John joined Bladon Lines, he only agreed to do so if those contracts were done in a company name called Bladon Lines Yates, or Yates-Smith Bladon Lines, or Bladon Lines Yates-Smith or something. And so although he didn't have the contracts in his name, he had contracted them all. And of course, he explained to all these owners that if they didn't contract with us, John wouldn't be there to help them in the middle of the night. John wouldn't be there to control the staff, to keep their mirrors glistening and whatever. And all these owners were, oh, no, John, we want to continue with you. We want to continue with you. And then John tried to get some money out of Yates-Smith Bladon Lines. And Christopher Needler said, well, I will, but only if I invest in YSE. And I said, no way. No way. So John did have to lose quite a bit of money by just pulling out of that. Everyone was very, very kind to us. They thought we'd been bad, or I had been badly treated. Peter Hardy wrote an amazing article. Other journalists really helped as well. Britannia gave us a fantastic rate on a little plane. Now, if I look back to think, we were committing to 125 seats on a plane for an entire winter season. And we didn't even have one booking at that stage. But we also had very lucky things. We took an office in Brummill Road. We took a phone number off the business village. And it just happened to be one that Ski Les Alpes had given up. So a lot of people rang Ski Les Alpes to book holidays. And we said, oh, funnily enough, we're YSE. Would you like to go to Val d'Isère? And more importantly, people used to ring and say, I want to work for you. Well, would you like to go to Val d'Isère? Oh, yes, please.
Right. So you sorted out your staffing and you got a few inquiries in at the time. And, YSE's now been in business, I think, for 35 years, way longer than Bladon Lines ever existed. You mentioned earlier about Bladon Lines adding on more and more resorts. And, I think we mentioned 30 before, but you've always been a Val d'Isère specialist. Have you ever considered adding other resorts on?
In the early days, I mentioned it to John and he'd say, okay, you go off and do that, but I'm not having anything to do with it. You're talking about a man who doesn't even acknowledge the existence of team. So, he was not going to expand to Maribel or Verbier or anywhere. And, Val d'Isère has served us well.
For sure. And, evidently, In some cases, rapid growth isn't always the best option for a company. And I think Bladon Lines are probably a proof of that. But, you've been in business for over 3 decades. And during that time, we've seen numerous global crises. We've seen a lot of ski companies fall along the way during that time. I mean, there have been wars, the Gulf War, pandemics, financial crises. What's seen you through those different challenges, would you say?
Well, our second year, Norman Lamont pulled out of the ERM, which was a bit of a shock to the system, but we weathered. And our very first year, we had the Olympics. And the owners all said, well, you can't have the 2 weeks of the Olympics. We want to make money then. And in fact, then they all came with the begging bowl. We haven't got clients. Can you take it? And we'd say, well, we can try. It did cost us money because we had to have 2 empty legs on the flight. But actually, in our first year, having 2 really expensive weeks, which the owners took far more off the rent than proportionately was probably, I think John negotiated very well that year. Then we had the ERM, then we had Lehman Brothers, where we reduced all our holidays to $599, I think, just to get rid. COVID and Brexit have been another hurdle. Our working model now compared to 2018 is completely different. We have no flights, we have centralized catering, we don't any longer have to employ chefs and cooks. All our staff are on French contracts. We have to get visas and work permits. It is just a very different working environment.
As I mentioned, other companies have, not managed to get through those periods, and you have. I think probably that's related to the loyalty of the clientele that you have, because you have quite a high percentage of returners, right?
Our rate is probably 65% actual returners, and then probably another 10 to 15% who come because they've been recommended by someone who's been with us.
Well, that is, a really fantastic figure, and I think that someone said to me, I can't recall exactly who it was, I may have read it, but there's only 2 things you need to do to be successful in business. You need to have happy customers, and you need to make a profit. And if you can keep doing that, maybe you don't make a profit every single year over 35 years in business with wars and discounting, etc. But if you deliver a product where the customers are that happy that 65% of them, 2/3 are coming back on an annual basis, then that evidently means that you must be doing the right thing there. So that must be very satisfying to know that you created that.
It is. I mean, in fact, in our 35 years, we've only had 3 years where we haven't made a profit. The ERM, Lehman Brothers, 2020, 21, when we didn't have any clients. We've always kind of found a way. Even during 2019, 20, and then 21, 22, we sold some chalets on Airbnb. We did have some clients.
As you mentioned, to be able to get through all of that period and be able to be profitable, because it's very difficult running a ski company when you have no control over 2 things essentially that make a huge amount of difference, which is the snow conditions. How are they going to affect bookings this year? And the exchange rate, which we've always been subject to, whether it's withdrawing from the ERM or dealing with the French franc or dealing with the euro. These things are completely out of your control. You need to take big decisions about buying large amounts of euros in advance, typically. And so there's a lot of elements that go into it. So, maybe you're being quite modest about it, but, I found it very interesting just talking about your journey through the ski industry from the Olympics back in 1976 to that Bladon Lines time. And we'll reiterate, I'll put a link into the show notes about that, and then to YSE and being in business for 35 years. I found it really interesting, and hopefully our listeners have found it interesting as well. And I'd like you to thank you very much for your time today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Fiona. Apart from hearing about her exploits as a junior racer, I think it adds a lot to episode 251, covering the rise and fall of Bladon Lines. And I know I've said this already, but if you haven't listened to it yet, I highly recommend it. I should add that after we stopped recording, Fiona told me more about John Yates-Smith's 50th celebrations in Val d'Isere at the end of the season. She particularly wanted to thank James Ferguson and Dougie Denton and her co-worker Annabelle for all their work in organising that event. In total, over 250 ex-staff gathered in resort for the party, which I think says something about the loyalty of YSE employees. If you have any feedback on this episode or any of our recent episodes, why not let me know? I enjoy all feedback about the show. I like to know what you think, especially about our features. So please contact me on social at The Ski Podcast or by email, theskipodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the podcast, there are 3 things you can do to help. You can review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That helps listeners find us. You can subscribe, and every episode will be automatically downloaded for you, so you can catch up at your leisure. And you can book your ski hire with Intersport Rent using the code SKIPODCAST or take the link in the show notes. There are now 266 episodes of the Ski Podcast, and 142 of those episodes were listened to in the last week. There is so much to listen to in our back catalogue. We have covered so many destinations and stories. Just go to theskipodcast.com, search around the tags and categories, and you're bound to find something of interest to you. You can follow me at Skipedia and the podcast at Facebook and Instagram at The Ski Podcast. I'd like to thank Fiona for sharing her time with me for this interview. And finally, listener, thank you for joining us wherever in the world you're listening right now. And until next time, goodbye.